Time for this debate has expired. The House now comes to consideration of the report of the Privileges Committee on the question of privilege regarding the use of social media to report parliamentary proceedings.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Chris Finlayson.
Mr Speaker, I move that the House take note of the report of the Privileges Committee on the question of privilege regarding the use of social media to report parliamentary proceedings. Let me first outline to the House how this issue arose. Last year, a very senior member of the House, as I recall it, was tweeting certain comments about the Speaker. They did not give rise to a particular reference to the Privileges Committee, but the Speaker referred to the Privileges Committee as a general matter of privilege, the implications for Parliament of MPs and other people using social media to report on parliamentary proceedings and to reflect on members of Parliament, including the Speaker. The Privileges Committee looked at this most interesting issue over a number of months, and so that we could look at it in a careful and methodical way, we set ourselves some terms of reference. And essentially there were three issues that we wanted to look at. First, whether there should be some restrictions or guidelines applying to members' use of handheld electronic devices in the chambers and committees, and I'll come back to the committees in a minute. And that included, obviously, accessing social media to comment on the proceedings. Secondly, whether Parliament's rules require modernising to reflect the reality, the challenges and the opportunities provided by social media, especially where the House and committees are using social media to disseminate information and to facilitate participation. And thirdly, whether in this new era of social media, whether the current rules relating to reflections on the Speaker or other presiding officers or members could amount to a contempt. Can I immediately acknowledge all the assistance that we received from the various witnesses? Both the former and the present Clerk of the House were extremely helpful in the information they provided to the committee. And as is our practice, we wrote to, as it were, brother and sister jurisdictions in the Commonwealth to gain some guidance from them, and I acknowledge the reports that we received from Westminster and Canada. And I also want to acknowledge that this is not a novel issue in parliaments around the Commonwealth. The Victorian Parliament has been looking at this very issue. As one would expect from a report of the Privileges Committee, it's short, it's concise, and it makes a number of very practical comments and recommendations. The first one, which will be of great relief to everyone here, is that members of the Privileges Committee are not Luddites. We recognise the reality of social media and that to stand King Canute-like and try and stop the tide coming in would be an exercise in uselessness. And I'm pleased to see Dr. Kennedy Graham in the House this afternoon. Even he agreed with that proposition. Even Mr Peters agreed with it. And I do acknowledge Mr Peters' profound contribution to the discussion. So we actually see the use of social media as a very positive development, and the committee had no intention of questioning whether members and others could use it to report on parliamentary procedures. And we recognise that the use of social media has facilitated much more diverse communication and much better conversations about Parliament, and that's all very much for the betterment of our democracy. But it's important to note that the committee has taken the time to remind members of a couple of very important points. First, that all members of Parliament should be aware that anything said on social media may not be protected by parliamentary privilege and could be potentially actionable in the court. And I refer honourable members to Section 7 of the Parliamentary Privilege Act 2014, which sets out the purpose of parliamentary privilege. And I also refer honourable members to section 10 of the same Act, which defines what exactly a proceeding in Parliament is. It is all words spoken and acts done in the course of, or for the purposes of, or incidental to, the transacting of the business of the House or of a committee. So if one is sitting in the House merrily tweeting away, it will not necessarily be part of the proceeding of the House, and so the best advice that can be offered is watch it. The second thing is, members need to be careful not to disclose confidential select committee proceedings or reports through social media. Perish the thought, I'm sure it would never happen, but members need to be advised that Standing Order 410Q could get them into hot water if they go about tweeting the contents of a report. It's potentially a contempt to divulge the proceedings or the report of a select committee or subcommittee contrary to standing orders. So, Mr. Speaker, the committee has proposed a particular approach to members using electronic devices to film or take photographs from the floor, and it's a matter on which there are currently no rules. So there was concern about improper use of photography and filming by members, especially where a member has taken a photo of another member in the House without permission and used it for political advantage, and a number of examples were given to us. I regret to say that I thought it reflected very poorly on those who had taken those photographs. I think of a photograph taken of the Green co-leader at about 10 to 10 at night when she was busily studying some report. It was offensive, it shouldn't have happened, and it was a very poor reflection on the member who did it, who has now left the House. But I hope that sort of thing is not going to happen in the future. I'm not going to name names because he's on your side. He was on our side. Anyway, he's gone now. At the same time, the committee recognised that special events in the House, including swearings-in, maiden and valedictory speeches, waiata after treaty settlement bills, are appropriate occasions for members to photograph or film from the floor of the House. There was a very interesting question, which I'm sure Mr. Parker is going to address, the issue of selfies and whether or not selfies are appropriate. I'm not, so I'll leave the whole issue of selfies to the MP for Rumataka or Mr. Parker. But suffice to say, on balance, I think we thought that selfies were inappropriate. To assist members, the committee has recommended that Mr. Speaker issue guidance based on existing rules of the House to all MPs and to the press gallery on appropriate use of social media to report on parliamentary proceedings, and there are some very useful guidelines set out as Appendix C to the report. Finally, sir, there are some comments made on reflections on MPs. I mean, let's take this, and I'm sure it's a pure hypothetical. If a member of the House yelled out in the House that, and this is hypothetical, the Speaker was a jerk or didn't know what he was doing or useless, clearly that would be contempt, and the person would be hauled before the Privileges Committee quicker than one could say contempt of the House. But the issue that can arise is what happens when someone tweets those kinds of comments, and all I can say, the best advice I can give is be very careful, because that same tweeting could result in a member being hauled before the committee, and the Deputy Leader of New Zealand First would, I see from his nodding, that he would utterly endorse such a reference. Can I also say something finally about official television coverage, because both the clerk and the chair of the press gallery proposed removing the prohibition on the use of official television coverage for satire, ridicule and denigration, and there's been a bit of comment on that in the paper in the last few days. I think the overwhelming majority of the committee thought that it's time for that rule to go. In fact, it itself is fatuous and makes us look a bit silly. And it seems that we're out of touch and wary of criticism. I don't think it's ever been used before. that's the sort of rule that might apply in North Korea or Stalinist Russia, but not in New Zealand, and we have to be big enough and tough enough to take a bit of satire from time to time. So that's the report, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the officials, want to thank my colleagues on the committee, especially the Deputy Chair. I want to thank the witnesses. As I say, it's a concise report, tries to cut to the chase and provide you, Mr. Speaker, with some guidance on guidelines on how one can deal with tweeters and people who bring your great office and you yourself into disrepute.
The question is, that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Chris Hipkins.